So, well, welcome everyone. It's great to see you. And my name is Yorella Andrews from the Visual Cultures Department, and I've been convening this lecture program. I just want to introduce today's event. So the topic, as you will know, is Crisis and the Aesthetics of Decoloniality. And our speaker is Anthony Faramelli, who we've known and loved for many years here in the department. He's a visiting researcher with us at the moment, and he's also a recovery program consultant. His research is situated at a really interesting intersection between psychosocial theory, psychoanalysis, and post-colonial politics. And he has an explicit focus on institutional analysis in his work. And some of you may be aware of the series he presented for us. Was it last term, and no, was it last term?
It's a year ago now.
Term, a year ago, yeah.
The spring program.
This topic with Jana Graham. There's somebody, could you please mute, because there's some creaking and crackling coming from somewhere. That would be great. Thank you. He has written a number of books, including Resistance, Revolution, and Fascism. I can never say that word. Zapatismo and Assemblage Politics. He's the editor with Rob White and David Hancock of Spaces of Crisis and Critique, Heterotopias Beyond Foucault. He's the founding member of the Network for Institutional Analysis. And he's a member of the executive board of the Association for Psychosocial Studies. And he's currently completing his second monograph, which is called The Mass Psychology of Fascism in the Age of Machines, Big Data, Surveillance and Control. And with us this evening is Dr. Eric Harper, who is going to be conversing with Anthony afterwards before we head into a wider question and answer. And Eric is a psychotherapist. He's a social worker and a human rights activist. He's also currently teaching here at Goldsmiths in the Department of Social, Therapeutic and Community Studies, which is fantastic. He works in London with homeless persons, presenting with both mental health and addiction challenges. And prior to this, he managed a mental health crisis centre and drug and alcohol structured day rehab programme. He's worked in Africa and the USA with war trauma and torture survivors, and also assisted with the founding of the African Sex Worker Health and Human Rights Alliance. So two incredibly active, incredibly busy, incredibly proactive individuals. It's a real honour to have you with us this evening. And I just now want to hand over to Anthony to go ahead and present your talk to us. I believe it's about 50 minutes, then we'll have a break. Oh, the other thing to say is if you want to ask questions, there will be two options. Either you can put your questions into the chat and we'll keep an eye on that, or you might prefer just to unmute yourself and maybe raise your hand and then ask your questions afterwards. All right, lovely, thank you. Anthony, you're muted.
All right, there we go. All right, thanks, Yorella. Thank you for that introduction. And I also want to thank the Department of Visual Cultures and Yorella for inviting me to speak today. Before I begin, I also just have to say how excited I am to have Eric as the respondent. Beyond being an incredibly important and prolific thinker, anti-racist activist, anti-colonial activist in South Africa, and a psychotherapist, Eric has also been something of a mentor to me in my ongoing training in group facilitation and psychotherapy. So it's quite special to have him here as the respondent. I should also say that my talk today is going to be heavily informed and inspired by the work of Andy Goffey. So for those of you who were able to be at Andy's presentation at the public program last year, then you would have heard a little bit of his work on the pathic, specifically how phenomenology informs institutional psychotherapy and institutional analysis. If you didn't get a chance to to see that talk. I believe it's on the department's YouTube channel. So it's Andrew Goffey. I really recommend that. His new work is quite inspiring and very much informs my thinking that that this talk is derived from. So to begin with, I think it's important to kind of put this all into context. In fact, just this morning, I was speaking with another colleague just about the enormous scale of events that we're all collectively facing at the moment. When we see the violence that kind of gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement, the violence that anti-racist protesters have been subjected to, both by the state as well as by armed white militias, terrorist groups, really, it becomes really hard to find a vocabulary to think about this within. Just the massive scale and the way in which violence is interconnected and global makes it difficult to grasp the problem and to think through anti-racist strategy. I think an important kind of anecdotal point to this is the same day of the Capitol riots, the same day when the white militias and white supremacists stormed the Capitol in America. In my neighborhood in North London, outside of a school, police detained a young 16-year-old boy, a person of color. And as he was detained, they assaulted him. They punched him in the face. So whilst these are two separate incidents, and whilst the scale is different, they both have the same, they both come from the same seed, and it's something that I think is interconnected. And this is what I think makes it so hard to find a vocabulary to think about this moment within. It makes it so hard because the scale is both the immediate personal violence of a cop punching someone who's already in handcuffs, as well as these big, spectacular moments of violence when we see white supremacists storming the Capitol in America. So what I want to try to do today is use Fanon and the work done in institutional psychotherapy to propose a psychosocial framework to approach these issues and to help us formulate anti-racist and decolonial strategy. So it's not a small task. So what I'm trying to do today is very much a work in progress. However, I do believe that by looking at institutional psychotherapy, we can find the tools to dismantle the master's house and build something much better in its place. Right, so crisis and the aesthetics of decoloniality. For anyone who's somewhat familiar with my work, you know that crisis is something that really haunts my thinking. And the reason for this, I think, is because crisis seems to be not so much the exception, but very much the norm. Be it the crisis in the university, something which Ash Sharma has recently written about in a brilliant article that is on his academia page. I highly recommend people read that. Or if it's the crisis, or rather crises, of capitalism, migration, refugees, and more recently, the global public health crisis and the crises around racism and racist violence. And in fact, you often read commentators who argue that it feels as though crisis is something that we just can't escape, that we're living through an omnipresent crisis. However, I don't think this is quite right. The problem is that we're always on the verge of crisis, but unable to resolve it. Crisis is a term that tends to be misunderstood and inappropriately used to signify a moment of potential terminal breakdown in social or psychic life. But in reality, crisis, it means having the ability to make a critical decision. The etymology of crisis comes from the ancient Greek word krisis, which is the power to distinguish and judge, and from the word krino, which is to choose or to decide. And in fact, crisis and critique both originate from the same root word. So in other words, far from meaning a potential terminal breakdown in social relations or of the psyche, crisis signifies a disruption that creates an affective space and allows for critical analysis. So ultimately, we can say that crisis presents an opportunity for radical change. And thinking through crisis as creating space for critical reflection and judgment implies a consideration for the primacy of the affective experience of crisis. Or phrased differently, crisis is something that's always felt before it's understood. Now, crisis also has a very special importance in mental health work, the other field that I engage in. In fact, psychosis is often understood and spoken about as a crisis situation. As such, contemporary psychotherapy has ostensibly become the art of preventing or containing crisis. This creates a kind of breathless atmosphere, a sort of contained or often literal imprisonment, an imprisoned affective space that prevents the crisis from ever being resolved. Now, it seems to me that there's a direct relationship between the practice of containing crisis in mental health work and the way in which social and political crises are contained. More specifically, this got me asking myself, what was it about George Floyd's murder that ignited a global movement confronting racism at both the structural and institutional level? The violence is certainly not new, nor do I really accept the common assertion that it's just newly visible. In my lifetime, going back to the early 90s, really, with the Rodney King beating, these videos, these countless videos, literally countless videos of police violence against people of color that then spurns a protest is something that has just been repeated over and over again. But the crisis was always able to be contained and as such unresolved. And it's this process of containing and not resolving it that strikes me as absolutely colonial. No, the reason I say that is the way in which psychopathology has been strategically deployed in projects of colonialism. Specifically, I'm thinking about colonial France and the way in which psychopathology was a political mechanism used to prevent decolonial movements, to prevent crisis. That is to say, the psychopathology was used to prevent judgment, to prevent individuals contained in a disciplinary space from action. This is perhaps most operative if you look at the work of the École Psychiatrique d'Alger, the Algiers Psychiatric School, or the Algiers School. The Algiers School was developed under the direction of Antonin Perrault, who inaugurated it in 1938 at the bleeded Joinville Psychiatric Hospital, the very same hospital where Fanon would later work. Now, beyond its role as the predominant school of thought in French colonial psychiatry, the Algiers School played a very specific and important role in France's project of colonial domination. Perrault argued that the Algerians had no concern for the future and were intellectually childish, but with none of the child's natural curiosity or other good traits. Moreover, they had none of the, quote, mobile and polymorphous, at times rich psychoplasticity of the civilized and European, leading Perrault to conclude that the native was normally abnormal. So to conflate the normal and the pathological in Algerian population was, in fact, key to the French colonial project. To pathologize an entire population is to effectively render them a child and legally render them a child with all the assumed pre-logical and primitive psyche. This meant that there was a certain obligation to remove legal voice, and the state becomes obliged to care for them, care being defined solely within carceral and pejorative terms. This is maybe even most explicit in one of Perrault's students, Don Combe Ariel, who wrote that the Algerians were not only ordinarily pathological, but were also born criminals, and argued that the French colonial project was in fact a civilizing mission that needed to be done to preserve order and save the indigenous from themselves. This gave justification for the creation of a contained carceral atmosphere that colonized native people. It's basically created a penal colony. So a penal colony organizes space to create an affective quality, an aesthetics, which creates an ambiance or atmosphere of penality, which, as Michel Foucault has argued, renders individuals both docile and economically useful. Foucault traces the origins of the prison to the birth of liberalism, where the prison came to be naturally understood as an egalitarian punishment that through the deprivation of liberty achieves a civilizing transformation of the individual. Given this positivist understanding of the prison, it's really no surprise that the birth of the prison coincided with the birth of psychology, modern capitalism, and shortly preceded the reformation of French colonialism as a civilizing mission. Now, this is not to say, of course, that the experience of the penal colony was equally distributed across the colonial state. For the French colonial project to function, space had to be stratified in a way that imprisoned indigenous populations, but not the settler colonialists. And just as a kind of side note, whilst I'm focusing on the French colonial project, this is something that I think really runs throughout the history of colonialism, certainly in North America. If you think about the settler colonialist relationship with the indigenous populations, this is something that I think plays out very much today in the reservation system. Let's see, going back here. So Fanon went into great detail to describe the bifurcation of colonial space, the space's aesthetic qualities, its ambiance, and the forms of violence that these environments produced in the opening chapter of The Wretched of the Earth on violence. It's worth quoting him here at length. So this is, to quote Fanon, "The zone where the natives lives is not complementary to the zone inhabited by the settler. The two zones are opposed, but not in the service of a higher unity. Obedient to the rules of pure Aristotelian logic, they both follow the principle of reciprocal exclusivity. No conciliation is possible for the two terms. One is always superfluous. The settler's town is a strongly built town, all made of stone and steel. It's a brightly lit town. The streets are covered with asphalt. The garbage cans swallow up all the leavings, unseen, unknown, hardly thought about. The settler's feet are never visible, except perhaps in the sea. But there, you're never close enough to see them. His feet are protected by strong shoes, although the streets of his town are clean and even, no holes, no stones. The settler's town is a well-fed town, an easygoing town. Its belly is always full of good things. The settler's town is a town of white people, a town of foreigners. The town belonging to the colonized people, or at least the native town, the Negro village, the Medina, the reservation, is a place of ill fame. Peopled by men of evil repute. They are born there. It matters little where or how. They die there. It matters not where or how. It is a world without spaciousness. Men live on top of each other. Their huts are built on top of one another. The native town is a hungry town, starved of bread, of meat, of shoes, of coal, of light. The native town is a crouching village, a town on its knees, a town wallowing in the mire. The racist colonial world is a world where the settler and the native zones are heterotopic inversions of each other, mimicking the relationship between the town and the prison, as well as between the town and the asylum. The colonial spatial relations produce forms of racialized homogeneity that are embedded in the daily spatial practices and infused in the bodily and affective representational spaces of the colonized, even as they are strictly separated from the colonizer. Now, this has a direct impact on the formation of subjectivity, the formation of how we come to understand ourselves. That is to say, subjectivity has a direct correlation to the deprivation of liberty. And the colonized, racialized psychiatric patient is therefore doubly excluded and confined. This doubling of exclusion and the deprivation of liberty has a perverse effect on the role of crisis in mental health discourse. If we are to accept Foucault's position that psychiatry's disciplinary power creates docile bodies, then the possibility of crisis is foreclosed, insofar as the disciplinary apparatus does not allow for judgment or for choice. The colonial racialized psychiatric subject is held in a type of suspended animation, static in both space and time, and deprived of crisis. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about institutional psychotherapy, how they understand ambiance, and an analysis of carceral space. The experience of existential crisis is something that haunts institutional psychotherapy. Indeed, it can be argued that this movement was born out of the greatest European crises of the 20th century, the Spanish Revolution and the Second World War. Institutional psychotherapy's origin really can be traced in 1939 in France at the Saint-Alban Hospital and the work of Paul Blavet, François Tosquelles, Lucien Bonafé, and Lucien Bonafé. During occupation, these doctors pioneered a form of social therapy with the aim to resist both Nazi occupation as well as the asylum system, which they likened to the concentration camp. The work done at Saint-Alban not only succeeded in protecting its patients from Nazi death camps, but it also became a sanctuary for the resistance. During this time, those working at Saint-Alban formed the Société des Gouvernants with the aim to, quote, resist and create, to resist the policy of natural selection that was killing the mentally ill, to resist the Vichy regime that was propagating it, and to resist the broader tendencies of homogenization and segregation that characterize the treatment of mentally ill, to create a therapeutic conviviality in the face of segregation, and with it, to create a new direction in psychiatry, a psychiatry that would be an art of living sympathy, not an alienation, but an accompaniment of the victim. So shortly following the war, 2 junior doctors joined them at Saint-Alban, Jean Houry and Frantz Fanon, as well as, slightly later on, a very young student intern named Félix Guattari. They came and worked with Tosquelles to transform the social therapy developed during the war into institutional psychotherapy. Institutional psychotherapy is not so much a coherent practice as it is a movement of politically committed mental health practitioners. The evolving approach they utilized is designed as a resistance to the enclosed and alienated spaces created by the concentration camp asylum system and societies that engender this form of segregation. It's the construction of a heterotopic inversion of society, an opening of counter spaces that work to disalienate and depersonalize, in the words of Tosquelles. Institutional psychotherapy is fundamentally based on the idea that the hospital is a microcosm of society and the hospital is ill. Therefore, to cure the patients, you had to first cure the hospital. The treatment of the hospital is carried out through the construction of space. Not necessarily geometrical or architectural space, but, to quote Jean Houry, something that puts an architectonic of relations into place, of different roles, different functions, and different people. It's a question of being able to locate the site within which something happens and what happens, end quote. This entails an emphasis on the daily life of the hospital and the importance that ambiance may play in the psychotherapeutic process. Building off the work of Merleau-Ponty, who is a big influence on both Houry and Fanon, Jean Houry defines ambiance as the experience of environments in everyday life. This means that space is fundamentally understood as the universal power connecting bodies and things. All knowledge is established and dependent on our perception of the space we inhabit, meaning that the environment facilitates bodily actions and social interactions, creating habits through stable perceptual associations that anticipate responses from the world. This ambiance or atmosphere created by space forms a relation between beings and the world, as well as a shared understanding of the world. And it's probably important here just to take a moment to think about some of the terminology. So when you read, especially if you read Jean Houry and Frantz Fanon in the original French, they're both drawing on Merleau-Ponty and this notion of ambiance. In French, ambiance and atmosphere they could be used somewhat interchangeably, much the same as in English, but there's a slight difference. So whereas ambiance is this kind of experience of a space, atmosphere has a added connotation of atmosphere, of breath, of oxygen. So what I find really interesting is when you read the Jean Houry, he always talks about the ambiance of a hospital, as does Fanon when he talks about his work in Lita Joinesville. But when Fanon talks about colonialism, he no longer uses the word ambiance, but atmosphere, in order to kind of have that double meaning of the affective experience of space, but also the way in which space literally suffocates a person. In this talk, I'll use the terms ambiance and atmosphere somewhat interchangeably, but just important to understand that subtle difference in the way they're used. So the analytic focus on the everyday is really what undergirds institutional psychotherapy and informed Fanon's approach both to politics and mental health. Fanon analyzed everyday racism as an alienating spatial relation, treated colonialization as a spatial organization, and viewed decolonization as part of a form of reappropriating and transforming spatial relations in the colonial city and through the construction of a nationwide socio-spatial alliance. Indeed, throughout On Violence, Fanon looks at how the aesthetic production of colonial zones creates an atmosphere that's imbued with violence and penality. That is, to quote Fanon, it serves to create around the exploited person an atmosphere of submission and of inhibition, which lightens the task of policing considerably. So we can see here how the ambiance and atmosphere of a town works to police its population. There's a direct relationship then between penality and mental illness, since, following the work of Fanon and institutional psychotherapy, mental illness is caused by the alienation from the world and the loss of existential freedom. It is ostensibly a pathology of liberty. That means to say mental illness results not from some kind of biochemical process, but from being deprived of liberty. As such, the cure can be nothing less than the radical transformation of society itself. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about institutional psychotherapy as it was practiced in Bleda-Jonesville and Fanon's ethico-aesthetic paradigm. When Fanon arrived at Bleda-Jonesville in 1953, the perversity of confined space of French colonialism following France's liberation from Nazi occupation was not lost on him, writing that, quote, "Under German occupation, the French remained men. Under French occupation, the Germans remained men. In Algeria, there's not simply the domination, but the decision to the letter not to occupy anything more than the sum total of the land. The Algerians, the veiled women, the palm trees, and the camels make up the landscape, the natural background to the human presence of the French." End quote. At the time, Bleda was known as Algeria's capital of madness, and telling someone that they should, quote, "be in Bleda with the madmen" was a conventional way of ending an argument. Bleda-Jonesville's aesthetic and spatial design was carceral. The hospital was surrounded by a high perimeter wall and supervised by that was supervised, as well as a massive gate that made it look quite sinister from the outside. However, once you get past the gate, it was a relatively pleasant environment with a big park, some sports facilities and gardens with tree-lined avenues, and it's kind of nice, two-story buildings. And I think it was this kind of dual presence of space where whilst it was very prison-like on the exterior, on the interior, there was a certain opening up. And I think really that's what allowed Fanon to get in there and do the work that he ultimately would do. When Fanon arrived at the hospital, it was criminally overcrowded. It was built to house a maximum of 1,200 patients. However, in 1953, it had 2,200 patients. When describing how the overcrowding impacted the hospital's ability to care for patients, Fanon, as well as 3 other co-authors, wrote, quote, "As the wards cannot be extended, even the smallest spaces were soon used up, and the massive overcrowding of units became such that the planned regulation of capacity nearly doubled everywhere. A tuberculosis ward was designed for 32 patients, hosted 74. The ward for, quote, agitated patients, planned for 44, contains 106. A ward planned to host 80 difficult patients contained 165, etc., etc. Moreover, the hospital, which at the time of the building was planned for only 971 patients, was more than 2,000. So basically, they got there and people were crammed in these kind of small, imprisoned spaces. There was no workshops, there were no day rooms. People were confined largely to very small chambers, kicked outside for an hour of exercise a day, and then put back inside. So in many ways, there was no difference to the ordering of the hospital than the ordering of, how all of us imagine a kind of maximum security prison would be. So this issue, the issue of overcrowding, was further exacerbated by the serious problems with discharging patients, especially the Muslim patients. To quote Fanon, "The problem was already made difficult owing to some realities of a geographic order, becomes almost insurmountable. The absence of any policy or local mental health assistance." So there's just nothing in place to support patients, especially the Algerian patients, to be discharged. Fanon came, he was one of 4 kind of chief doctors, along with a Dr. Ramey, who was one of Perrault's students and very much indoctrinated within the Algiers school, and doctors Lacanton, Mercuti, and Decbert, who were more metropolitan and more sympathetic to some of Fanon's politics. The ward at Blida Joinsville were segregated along ethnic lines, and Fanon had about 200 patients under his care, 165 European women and 22 male Muslim patients. Some of his patients were self-referred, however, the vast majority were committed to the hospital either by family or by the authorities. And the work of the Algiers school formed the doctoral basis for psychotherapy, both in Blida as well as throughout Algeria. And Fanon noted that the attitude of doctors and nurses alike was based on a priori racist assumptions. Nevertheless, Fanon immediately began to implement the institutional psychotherapy approach, first with the European women, establishing a weekly patient journal, a weekly staff patient meeting that doubled as a social event, a film club, and a record club, with patients writing reviews and responses to film and music in a ward journal. They began collectively celebrating hospital holidays, the first of which was Christmas in 1953, and this in turn inspired weekly social events and different celebrations. Additionally, Fanon set up ergotherapy and occupational therapy, both of which were well attended and elicited positive responses from the European patients especially. This was a quick success. Not only had the asylum life become less distressing for many, but the rhythm of discharge was markedly increased. So as soon as he started doing this, you saw this immediate uptake, especially amongst the European women, where forms of sociality started changing and the discharge rate began picking up quite quickly. They were able to support people to leave the hospital. So the goal here that Fanon was doing was really to affect the hospital by creating new institutions within it, to transform the abstract and impersonal multitude into a coherent group driven by collective work. These practices constitute what Felix Guattari would later refer to as the ethico-aesthetic, or creative life practices that resist the colonization of life to the fascisticity of biology, and to biology's essentializing assumptions. It is an ethics of life that encounters life in the newness of its forms. The ethical aesthetic creates institutional conditions in which an individual psyche is, to quote Guattari, connected to a range of expressive and practical registers in direct contact with social life and the outside world. In large part, this practice is a reconceptualization of space and, nodding towards Lacan's influence on institutional psychotherapy, a fluidity of space's signification. To explain this, Guattari describes the kitchen at Laborde as part of an apparatus where external aesthetic practices within the institution are folded into the signification of the kitchen, creating an ambiance, and this is Guattari's writing, an ambiance that allows for a greater degree of openness to therapeutic encounters, something which Guattari referred to as a coefficient of transversality. So in other words, to treat the institution, to rid it of the concentration-like structures, to make it a place of healing requires an aesthetic practice that creates an ambiance that would facilitate a greater coefficient of transversality. That is to say, something that would facilitate a greater openness to chance therapeutic encounters. It's probably important just to pause here and think about what they were really trying to do. So if you think about the function of a kitchen, what does a kitchen signify to us? It's a place where you cook, a place where you eat. They started thinking about the different ways in which kitchens facilitate forms of sociality. It's not the therapy room. It's not where people are going to have their one-on-one therapy. It's not where they're going for group therapy. It's not where they're going for ergotherapy. But it's a space where staff and patients come, they get their lunch, they sit down, and then they chat. And it's these chance encounters that really is where the therapeutic intervention happens. So every room, in a kind of Lacanian linguistic form, had its own signifier. And each room had a function that was really much more than its designated function. One way I think about this is the front stairs at a building where I used to work, where it was this little landing in front of the building that where I think some of the best therapeutic work happened. It happened while we were outside having cigarettes. It happened as we just started chatting to each other, not as support worker, key worker, patient, but rather as equals. And this is where this kind of degree of openness becomes created and generated by this reconceptualization of space. In fact, Uri once wrote that the whole project of institutional psychotherapy is a project of creating chance encounters. Right. So returning to Fanon's work at Blida Joinesville, in an article titled "The Social Therapy and Award of Muslim Men: Methodological Difficulties," Fanon and Jacques Azoulay, a junior doctor who Fanon worked quite closely with, wrote that while institutional psychotherapy yielded great success with the European women, the Muslim men in Fanon's charge did not respond. They note that this is because the practice of creating new institutions must be preceded with an analysis and understanding of indigenous society. Social therapy that is only possible to the extent that social morphology and forms of sociality are taken into consideration. So they corrected their course and established activities and created spaces that were more culturally familiar to the Algerian men. The most successful of these programs are arguably the ergotherapy, especially the gardening, the establishment of a Morris cafe where patients could play dominoes and converse with each other in a space that was decorated with their own paintings, as well as both European and traditional North African furnishings, and periodical meetings around a traditional oral storyteller. So these practices instituted a form of sociality that generated the same collective double power as created by the social clubs in the Europeans' wards. And this notion of double power is something that is also quite important in institutional psychotherapy. In almost a kind of Trotskyist register, it's this notion of creating a counterpower within a larger institution. And then the conflict between these two forms of power is really what allows for the institution to be healed from the inside out. So the ethical aesthetic practice is fundamentally resistant to carceral power. This is because, in its simplest terms, the ethical aesthetic is deployed to create a maximum amount of freedom. Not just freedom of movement, which is obviously important, but, and above all else, a subjective internal freedom that allows individuals to be open to these therapeutic encounters. It's through the chance encounters that the problem of the Mitsein, the problem of being together, is resolved through the formation of a collective. And actually, the work of the collective and the formation of the collective really cannot be overstated here. Collective work opens up a constellation or a grouping of heterogeneous factors into the social matrix, allowing for liberty of speech and, to quote Jean Uri, the continual analysis of and resistance to massive social alienation and its hierarchy, end quote. These encounters between doctor and patient, but also between nurses and other patients, breaks down the schematic relation of caregiver-care receiver into heterogeneous dimensions of psychiatric knowledge, sociality, and an ambiance that apprehends existential difference. This opens up an ambiance of freedom that gives you a greater open communication, disrupting the individualizing and alienating processes, allowing for a collective production of subjectivity. So what Fanon and Azoulay realized through their initial failure instituting institutional psychotherapy in the ward of Muslim men was that, despite their best intent, by organizing European activities, they were inadvertently reproducing colonial violence. Therefore, the patient's resistance to the therapeutic interventions should also be read as political resistance. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, when the analyzad, I can never say that word, opposes suggestion from the analyst, they're not resisting the analyst themselves, but rather resisting the erasure of their desire. As such, resistance in psychoanalysis conveys the desire to maintain the subject's desire, creating a form of resistance that's operative at both the unconscious as well as the political level. The Muslim men's desire, in this case, was to resist the imposition of European settler culture and to retain their own culture. In order to work with the patient's desire to achieve therapeutic outcomes, Fanon was forced to establish a new institution within the establishment of the hospital. So, approaching psychotherapy or any other creative practice by creating an institution forces the questions: who produces the institution, who articulates its subgroups, and is there a way to modify this production? Institutions are a malleable set of relations, a sort of modeling clay that can be worked to generate a higher degree of transversality throughout the larger establishment. As such, the institutions that Fanon created, such as the Moorish Cafe, created new forms of sociality and a change in the overall atmosphere of the hospital that went way beyond the ward of Muslim men. In other words, by creating new institutions that affirmed Algerian culture, Fanon instituted a larger process of purging the hospital's structures of coloniality, effectively decolonizing the Blida Joinsville Hospital. So now, just really quickly, I want to think about why are we talking about institutional psychotherapy? What is it about Fanon's work that can inform struggle today? So above and beyond all else, Fanon was a thinker of environment. He was primarily concerned with analyzing the ambiance that different spaces produce, understanding how subjects occupy the space of a clinic, and thinking through larger questions of power relations in different environments. In fact, in the obituary of Fanon that Tosquelles wrote, he said that Fanon embodied therapeutic space. The power relations Fanon engaged with are both life and land, and resistance, therefore, has to involve both. With this in mind, we see that his practice of creating new institutions designed to heal the establishment was not at all limited to his therapeutic practice, but also extended to his political work and his political militancy. I think this is most evident in his writing in the chapter, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness from the Wretched of the Earth. In this chapter, Fanon, foreshadowing what today is referred to as racial capitalism, analyzes how the coloniality of a nation's economy perpetuates neo-colonial Manchean structures of race, racial antagonism, and racism. This can only be subverted, Fanon argues, by the rapid transition from a national consciousness that's framed by Western colonial thought to a decolonized political and social consciousness. To achieve this, Fanon again looks at spatial practice, arguing that there must be, quote, decentralization in the extreme, through the reallocation and distribution of administrative institutions established in rural areas and towns outside of the capital city. By doing this, Fanon argues that the post-colonial African state creates a transversal power dynamics that will ensure governance and administrative power is decentralized and distributed throughout the population. Now, throughout the Pitfalls of National Consciousness, Fanon is explicitly translating his clinical techniques of institutional psychotherapy into a schema for post-colonial development in order to formulate a psychosocially informed approach to decolonizing social and governmental institutions. Through the creation of new institutions in the post-colonial state, Fanon theorizes that there would be an increase in the coefficient of transversality, creating an ambiance of openness that can heal the state in the same way that the practices of institutional psychotherapy heal the hospital. So to briefly return to the understanding of crisis given above, we can think alongside of Deleuze and Guattari and conceptualize crisis as a deterritorialization, or an event that constitutes a rupture in the social order and creates a space for judgment. However, the question then becomes, where will this line of flight land? We know from Deleuze and Guattari that deterritorializations are not in and of themselves liberating. They may result in destructive, authoritarian, even fascistic formations. The convergence of crisis that's marked 2020 and 2021 has created an effective space where social and political change is not only possible, but unavoidable. However, what this change will be is as yet undetermined. This is the reason why I think it's important to revisit Fanon during this moment of crisis. Throughout his oeuvre, Fanon articulates an ethics of life that's not reducible to mere bio-life. Rather, Fanon views life as collectively formed in relation to its environment. As Fanon details in his description of the collective drive to build a bridge, life is something that is collectively produced within an atmosphere that allows for openness and encounter. An atmosphere that's both literally and figuratively allows us to breathe. And this is what Fanon has to offer current anti-racist activism, a framework that's able to analyze the psychosocial structure of institutions and formulates a program for the creation of new institutions. And I think, quite importantly, we can see that this work is already happening. An important example is this new movement to defund the police, for example. So beyond the tagline, the movement to radically restructure policing and reallocate funding to community services will also radically disrupt the atmosphere of penality that's the reality for so many people. As Homi Bhabha reminds us, quote, "The state of emergency is also the state of emergence," end quote. The creative anti-racist practices that have been born out of contemporary crisis now have the potential to formulate a new ethical aesthetic paradigm, a new openness and freedom that reading Fanon today provides us with the analytic tools to create new and transversal institutions. All right, and that's it.
Thank you. That's
I need water.
We do normally have a 5-minute break. You probably need a bit of a drink, Anthony, to refresh your throat. So is that okay if we just have a break for 5 minutes, come back? So it's 17:55, so if we can come back at 6. Yeah, it looks like most people are here, so I guess it's 6 o'clock. Might as well go for
Back
it.
on.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got just some general comments and some questions. And my first one is trying to think about what links Fanon's to the time he lived to the time we're living in right now. And I suppose my first question to be thought about, and I'll list all my questions and just let you respond to whatever you want to respond to, Anthony. So my first question, which I think sometimes gets overlooked, is just how young Fanon was and the intensity of youth and how much this very young man achieved. And if we're going to talk about change, maybe it's about the agency of youth, but also sometimes about the stagnation of youth as well. So that was the one thought, was just something around youth and just how, and in terms of the burden that is placed on the youth of today. But the other thought in terms of Fanon's time in which he lived, and Fanon was very much caught up in, as you know, in existentialism, his friendship with Sartre, his reading of Merleau-Ponty, and other existentialists. And that time was sometimes, or post Fanon, people were speaking about the age of anxiety. This was the existential crisis, the age of anxiety. And I was thinking, I liked your situation of crisis, and I was wondering if the contemporary age is the age of crisis. And I was thinking, is there a relationship between the age of anxiety and the age of crisis? And what I thought, and my question was, does crisis, in the way that you formulate in it, invite a relationship with that which is both human and beyond the human? Because I was thinking that what anxiety did, in the way that Kierkegaard and other existentialists were speaking about anxiety invites new possible relationships to the world, but and a new sort of potentiality. But people shun those relationships. They're afraid of those relationships. They draw back. Hence, there's an anxiety. And you spoke about crisis invites something that affects us and something that we experience even before we can think it. So I was wondering, in a sense, if crisis is inviting a relationship with that which takes us beyond the human, in a sense, to what you speak about as an ethic of openness, an encounter with life, with a different way of breathing. And as you were speaking, I was thinking that, in a sense, Fanon said that we revolt because we can't breathe. But I was thinking, in a sense, maybe the revolt is the convergence of both the wretched of the earth and the wretched earth itself, a revolt against the impossibility of breath. So I was thinking, so that was my second question. Are we living in the age of crisis, and does this invite a relationship with that which is beyond the human, both the convergence of the wretched of the earth and the wretched earth itself? And then my last thought was, I was very struck by the pitfalls of national consciousness. It's one of my favorite chapters in The Wretched of the Earth, and people don't often make reference to it. And later on in your paper, which I don't think you mentioned in your talk, I'll just read what you said in your paper, just for those who didn't read this. Throughout the pitfalls of national consciousness, and I'm quoting Anthony, Fanon is explicitly translating the clinical techniques of the Institute of Psychotherapy into a schema for post-colonial development in order to formulate a psychosocially informed approach to decolonizing social and governmental institutions. Through the creation of institutions in the post-colonial state, Fanon theorizes that there would be an increase in the coefficiency of transversality. And I was wondering about that in relation to the time of COVID. And some of the expressions that Fanon uses in the pitfalls of national consciousness, which I think are so applicable to COVID and post-COVID. He speaks about the bourgeois as those who cannot learn, about an intellectual laziness, about a form of thinking that is simply stuck in a profoundly, in his words, it's profoundly cosmopolitan, and a deplorable stagnation. Now, aren't we in effect simply describing the thinking that's happening around COVID and post-COVID? I mean, one could say that we don't need, yes, of course, a vaccine is nice, but the vaccine that we really need is a vaccine against capitalism, or the acceleration of capitalism. The other thing that Fanon says, just in relation to the whole question of thinking, he says, if you want to understand colonization, the methodology, the thinking apparatus driving it was torture. In Anthony's terms, we could think about a violence which produces spaces in which people have no mental or physical space into which they can retreat. And that's very much the situation that's happened around COVID. It's breaking down life forms in which they become, the immunity totally breaks down, just turning them to some sort of molecular structure. So my last thought then was, are we in effect witnessing the convergence of this intellectual docility, this stagnation, as well as the methodology of torture that Fanon is speaking about? And it got me thinking that when Achille Mbembe speaks about the aesthetics of vulgarity, and he speaks about this in relation to African leaders, well, the aesthetics of vulgarity is very much what we see with not only with someone like Trump, but we also saw it with the leaders, we see it currently with the leaders of Russia, China, the UK, France, Italy, in other words, the G7. So in a sense, maybe the aesthetics that we are currently living in is a normalization at a global scale of the aesthetics of vulgarity. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks for that. God, that's a lot for me to think about. Maybe to respond to your first point about Fanon's youth. This is a bit of a flippant analogy, maybe, but it's the thing that pops into my head. Tupac Shakur, shortly before he was killed, was interviewed, and they were talking to him about kind of Black activism, and he said something that was quite interesting. He said that in the United States, you only have the chance to be a radical up to the age of 29. He said, like, from 30 on, your chance for kind of radical action is cut off. So for anybody who kind of knows Fanon's work or knows his biography, that he died crazy young. He was 36 when he died. So by the age of 36, what he had done was remarkable. But I also think it was this kind of overproduction, this kind of exhilaration of youth almost, that perhaps that's what killed him. But also, I think that's where a lot of the problems with Fanon come in. So like Yara just made a brilliant point about the feminist critique of Fanon, and that's a valid critique. Fanon was dead sexist. It's hard to deny the sexism that you get in a lot of Fanon, and it's hard to deny the homophobia. And something that we have to work with and work through. I would like to be, I tend to be somewhat perhaps overly forgiving in this case, insofar as he didn't take a lot of pauses to think. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you read the speed of his writing, it writes like somebody in a hurry. It's this kind of, it's funny that he always talks about being breathless, because his writing is breathless. It's just, he rips through the pages, and he just makes these statements that are just like, you read some of the things and you're just like, wait, what? I'd like to be generous and say that, like, it's because he never took the time to create the space for himself that he created for others in his therapeutic practice. Which I think also says a lot about what we need to think about in activism today. And that's where I think it becomes important. I think in a very real way, him not creating the space for himself to sit with his thoughts and sit with things that troubled him is really where you get the kind of feminist critique of Fanon. That the Algeria Unveiled is equal parts brilliant and equal parts horrible, for example. And it's because I don't think he took the time to sit with what made him uncomfortable about the discourses of the veil. Which is totally perverse, because that's what he did in every other aspect of his life and his thought. But to return to the question of youth, I don't necessarily think it's a matter of thinking of youth. Fanon was also a voracious reader of Nietzsche, so it's not a massive jump for me to talk about Nietzsche here. But if people are familiar with Nietzsche's work, he talks about these kind of phases of development, of intellectual development and creative development. And he says the kind of pinnacle, the mature point of development, maturity, is when you reach the point of a child. That's what we should strive for in our intellectual development, is to be childlike, and to be someone who asks the question, why? Constantly, why? So I think if we're talking about youth and stagnation in these terms, it's not a matter of, being 29 or being 49. It's a question of whether we retain this childlike drive to ask, but why? But why? Constantly, ad nauseum, but why? And I think it's that process. Baudrillard has this brilliant quote that he wrote shortly after the events of September 11th. When events around us speed up, we have an obligation to slow down. So I think it's that process of slowing down to kind of assess what's happening, to create an effective space that allows us to assess what's happening, to create an ambiance that allows that, is where we can overcome processes of stagnation, intellectual and otherwise. thinking of, oh, go on, please.
No, I was just going to say that's great. I really like what you're saying. It's slowed me down, and I'm listening to you. And I think it's also very nice. One must also make way for the youth to go beyond one. So I'm enjoying your guidance in this.
Oh, gee, now I'm blushing. But thinking about one of your other points, and thinking about this as going beyond the human, the wretched of the earth and the wretched earth. One of the things that's really struck me in a very visceral way in the last year is this notion of breath. Going on, the notion of I can't breathe, has a very specific signification right now, because not only does that mean the way in which authoritarian states, racist practices, racist policing quite literally chokes the breath out of people, but thinking about this in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, a disease that attacks our capacity to breathe. So it's this kind of double choke that we have right now. And to think about this, I think that for Fanon, it has to be an assemblage, a relationship between the human and the non-human, between the earth and land. We get this, I think some of the brilliant work done in notions of racial capitalism and environmental racism, you see this played out. Why was it in America that the Navajo Nation was so disproportionately impacted by COVID-19? It's a colonial system of racism, pure and simple. It's the way in which the racist settler colonial state in America, in Arizona and New Mexico, controls the land and codifies, stratifies the land that impacts the indigenous population on the land. I don't think as a species we have much hope unless we think about this beyond ourselves as species. When I was more environmentally active, I used to always say that the kind of perversity of environmental activism is you're actually doing it because I want the human species to live. I'm not necessarily doing it even for the earth, for Mother Earth or for Gaia or any of these kind of spiritual ideas. I'm doing it because, I think for coming generations to live, we need to do this, because we're within the same system. Unless we end up in some kind of sci-fi dystopian where the rich live in the clouds above us. Elon Musk and his fucking rocket ships, right? So I do think that reading Fanon does necessitate a thinking about thinking with and through the earth, with and through the land. And I think what's really interesting is that there are these really amazing projects that are happening that are thinking about this, where we can see new institutions forming. I'm getting a lot of hope out of things that are coming out of America right now. So in Jackson, Mississippi, there's the project, the Cooperation Jackson, where they're thinking about how to form a cooperative, sustainable economy, a kind of dual economy within Jackson, Mississippi, that works on the level of the cooperative, where things become cooperatized. This is something that, for people familiar with my other work, my interest in Zapatismo, and the work happening, the kind of quite amazing movement that we've had in Chiapas, Mexico over the last 25 years, since 94. This is very much what's happened in Mexican Chiapas, in the Lacandon jungle. I think the Zapatistas are another good practice to look at right now, because there's these capitalism, largely speaking, is reliant on a redeployment of the idea of care and resilience. And it's this kind of taking these notions of care and resilience and perverting them to a point where they become toxic. But, resilience to a degree, of course, is necessary. We need a certain resilience just to get out of bed in the morning, right? However, there comes to be a point where you have to say ya basta, you have to say enough. So something has to break. We have to resolve this crisis. And then think about this as the age of crisis rather than the age of anxiety. I think that's a quite correct way of thinking about it. But crisis and anxiety, anxiety is the effect of the experience of crisis.
Of course,
I don't know anyone who's not, sure, biting their nails down to the quick these days.
Should we open it up to?
Yeah.
Should we open up some other questions to the other audience? Because I think people have got a lot of questions for you.
Yes.
There's someone who's wanting you to comment on aesthetics.
Sure. So aesthetics, generally speaking, especially the way they were understood and deployed in Fanon and institutional psychotherapy, is about creating an atmosphere. So aesthetics as a creative practice is done to create a specific kind of atmosphere within a space. So if you read On Violence, which is by far Fanon's most misunderstood bit of writing, what he's doing in that chapter is he's talking about how there's two aesthetic regimes, in colonialism. There's an aesthetic regime in the settler town, which creates an atmosphere of openness, and an aesthetic regime in the colonized, in the native town, that is, carceral. So it's through aesthetic regimes that we create these kind of atmospheres. Cool. There's another question. The quote about when things speed up, you have to slow down. That was Jean Baudrillard. Yeah.
Also, just to say, there were a couple of questions earlier in the chat.
Do you want to read them out?
Yes. Well, one was, I'll do the second one first because it relates more to Fanon. There's a brilliant lecture. It might need a sentence. Why feminists were pissed off with Fanon. I think it might be worth your while. Interesting to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, yes. So I was trying to think about that a little bit earlier, but Fanon was sexist. I don't think there's a way to sugarcoat that. And specifically, you get this in his chapter, Algeria Unveiled. I believe that's in the collection of Dying Colonialism, or it might be towards the African Revolution. I always get those. I forget which book it's in. It's a problematic chapter. On one hand, it's the other place beyond On Violence where he analyzes the aesthetic production of the colonial city. But he goes through this kind of idea where he tries to read into this notion of jihad and reads into a certain fundamentalist reading of Islam, that after Fanon's death and after French colonialism, when Algeria fell into a civil war, allowed his writings to be co-opted by an Islamicist regime, where quite perversely, not only was it a regime that was Islamicist and sexist, but also very anti-Black. So there are these problems with Fanon, these kind of blind spots, if you like. And I think the problem with that is what I was saying before, is because he never took the time to slow down and think about what makes him uncomfortable. It's interesting. If you read someone like Alice Cherokee and her reflections on working with Fanon, you don't get that same kind of sexism, but it's something about the kind of breathless writing where he's just, he says something frankly stupid, but doesn't take the time to unpack what he's saying. I think that's a problem that we have with Fanon. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're able to spend so much time poring over these chapters, is because he never took the time to unpack the work himself.
Can I just comment on that as well, Anthony?
Yeah.
There's an irony in that with his major work, there were women who Fanon would just speak, and his wife, and I forget who the other person was, they would transcribe what he was writing. So there's a great irony. And the other irony is when he speaks about women in black skin, white mask, he tends to do it in almost quite essentialist terms. Whereas when he speaks about men, there's something which is very post-structuralist, whatever word you want to use. It's definitely anti-essentialist. So he's got these very... But it is also interesting that someone like Bell Hooks speaks about Fanon in quite a tender way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is the problem of intersectionality. And also, I think Fanon was also very much surrounded by male company. I mean, he fought as a soldier. I think he was very much surrounded by male company as well, which is problematic. But I like your notion of the slowing down and trying to and spaces which are not patriarchal. Are there other questions from people? I mean, there must.
Yeah. I mean, there was that question about, I don't know if you've answered it in a sense, but the one about wondering if there are great radical and experimental spaces that allow for more agency and autonomy in crisis care. Is that one that...
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of great examples to look at. So beyond the experiments in Chiapas and Cooperative Jackson, there's this whole kind of history, within radical psychiatry, where you had these, if not enduring moments of openness, at least temporary moments of openness. And you still, I mean, Labor Clinic, where Guattari worked, it's still up and running, and it's still a quite wonderful space. I think a lot of it is about how people work within an institution to unwork it from within. I mean, I know the charity where Eric and I both worked, if you get the two of us a couple of drinks in us, we have our long critiques of it, but what was and what still is brilliant about that charity is that you have these pockets of just absolute radical reworking and radical reformulation, that are just, breathtaking, really.
Does anyone want to make a comment or something? I mean, it doesn't have to specifically be a question, so we can just kind of experiment and just have a conversation. So I'm sure that people must. Someone. Yep. Hello.
Hi.
Hey.
Hey, I can try. I don't have a lot of time, and that's the nature of my question. But yeah, it was this kind of thing about the slowing down and the inability to slow down, Fanon's inability, but also our inability, and the violence that we experience right now around these pressures to keep everything going and disable that moment that we need, which is the moment to judge, to regroup, and to make something of what's happening to us. And maybe this isn't experienced across the board, but it's certainly for me, I've experienced it as a profound violence. And I guess I'm thinking about this in terms of the idea of ambience, because when we think of the Guattari and Uri and all of these ideas of ambience and transversality, the kitchen as a space, we think of them in spatial terms. And in fact, you kind of framed the carceral enclosure in terms of a kind of spatial apparatus, but it's also a temporal. For us, particularly in this moment of capital acceleration, it's also a temporal problem. And so I guess the question I'm trying to think about, I'm not asking you necessarily, maybe we can all think this together, is I have easier time conceptualizing spaces and harder time conceptualizing the ambience of time. How do you produce temporal ambience, temporal atmospheres that produce a different a way of responding, and how do we hold those kinds of atmospheres? I mean, I know certainly in therapeutic practice, I know in my own pedagogical practice, like sort of holding time for other kinds of activity that are not prescribed by the university, by the clinic, etc., is crucial. But I'm sort of thinking, how do we understand that in terms of ambience, temporal ambience? Yeah.
I mean, yes, Yes, you're right. This kind of way in which time has been reduced or taken away, the way in which we're deprived of time. At least the way I've kind of effectively experienced that is almost spatially, because when you are deprived of time, you feel enclosed, you feel claustrophobic.
And you can't breathe.
You can't breathe. I really don't know if it's because I'm an asthmatic or what it is, but this notion of breath is something that I always keep coming back to. Mm-hmm. But I think what's interesting is reflective practice is a good example. So
I was thinking about this exactly.
Yeah. It's also funny because Eric was technically my supervisor when I was a reflective practice facilitator.
And he was my reflective practice facilitator.
Guys, I'm making so
So when I was working under Eric's iron fist, that was very much what we were trying to create, was create an atmosphere where we can come in and talk. And what was always interesting, thinking about this from the point of facilitator rather than group participant, because the facilitator has that kind of weird inside-outside marginal position. But as a facilitator, when I was walking into a room to facilitate a group, the ambiance of that room would hit me like a wall. If there had been a crisis at the service where I was going to work, if somebody had been recalled, if somebody had been arrested, if there was a fight, when I would walk into the room where I was going to facilitate the group, I would feel that. So then what I saw my job as is that we held an hour and a half. So what my job as a facilitator was to hold that time and to spatialize time, if that makes sense. It's to give time a spatial quantity in order to allow people to work through things. And I think that's something pedagogically that as educators, that a lot of us do as well, to have unstructured time, that we as educators, our job is to hold it rather than fill it. And I think as a pedagogical practice, it's something it becomes really important.
Can I respond as well? Jana, I was curious what you thought, but when you were speaking, the first association I had was COVID was the fear of a breakdown that's already happened and that will happen again. And the breakdown forces an interval between sensory and motor experience. The interval being, that's the potentiality to reflect. The interval in the Bergson or the Deleuzian or whatever way we want to think about it, the interval to potentially to dream something. Because I think what was interesting about some of the lockdown period is that there's been the potentiality to dream other kinds of worlds, to have other kinds of images. And I think that in terms of slowing things down, it is the capacity to dream, not just the dreams of the night, but the capacity to dream and invite certain imagery and have certain thoughts, as opposed to this sort of rational, fellow-centric project where we can open a different way, to be affected, to have different kinds of images, different kinds of thoughts, which can invite a different kind of way of thinking.
Yeah, and that sort of brings up also one of the practices in reflective practice, which is, that kind of coming together regularly to reflect, which is this this technique you use, which is to ask people to produce imagery, to think and to produce imagery of, other scenarios, of the scenario even that they're in. So that's kind of an interesting answer to that question, that one of the ways to spatialize time is through the imaginary, in the imagination, and through the capacity to start to dream or imagine otherwise. Yeah.
There might. Oh, sorry, you're going to answer, aren't you?
No.
A comment. Because maybe in terms of thinking otherwise or other paradigm shifts, there's another comment or question actually in the chat from Harrison Jones, and I don't know whether Harrison wants to read that out himself or whether I should read it.
Hey, Julie, you can read it. That's
okay.
Fine.
All right. Okay. So first of all, he's saying it's great. Thank you. Hey to Eric also. The fact that Fanon read Nietzsche is fascinating in relation to the fact that Nietzsche himself was also very young, but also that his mode of thought was appropriated in the violence of the Nazi regime. But what he's coming to now, he says, I noticed in the lecture the difference in vocabulary between European and the native Algerian as Muslim. So I guess what he's getting at there, that a secular language to describe the Europeans and religious language to describe the Algerians. So Harrison continues, the violence of colonialism, whilst committed in the name of the fatherland, motherland, has its roots in science, or I suppose secular thinking, secular humanism. Cutting to the chase, to what extent do you think the age of anxiety, now the age of crisis, has to do with a secular mode of thought, the modern dark age? Do Fanon's writings negotiate the issue of religious belief and the solace taken in its narratives of suffering? Thank you.
That's a great question.
It is. Yeah.
So what you get with Fanon, and this is actually one of the areas where I think it becomes a wee bit problematic, is he fundamentally doesn't really get religion. So in most of his writings, he doesn't often talk about native Algerians, but he uses the word Muslim when he wants to say Algerian as a kind of catch-all. And later on, the writings that he did for Mujahideen, the FLN newspaper, he talks about the Islamic awakening and the commitment to jihad. But what he does in his treatment of religion is he tries to secularize it and thinks about Islam through the production of culture rather than as a kind of spirituality. Fanon, my reading of Fanon at least, was that he was incredibly materialist. He didn't have a lot of time or consideration for metaphysics. So his understanding of religion was always in materialist terms, which isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself. In fact, that tends to be how I approach it. It's how sociology has approached religion, at least since Weber, right? But he doesn't take a lot of time to work through what his deployment of religion means. I think there is a religiosity that you find, whether it's framed within metaphysics or not, to this belief. So if you look at the kind of the perversion or really just humanist thought that allowed for colonial domination, I think you find the same religiosity behind that. The same kind of blind faith in their superiority. The same kind of faith that they wanted to put into something. And I don't think Fanon took a lot of time to think about leaps of faith and how faith is directed. If that makes sense.
That does. Thank you. Does Fanon's thought then, the rejection of the metaphysics, is that directly inspired by Nietzsche's opinion towards religion?
I mean, I think the Nietzsche stuff maybe resonates. I don't know how much it is inspired by Nietzsche's stuff, or Nietzsche's disdain for religion, but I think that's probably what drew Fanon to Nietzsche. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Rachel's been waiting for ages. She's got her hand up.
Thanks for a fantastic talk, Anthony. Really enjoyed the new ground. I was thinking when Jana was talking about reflective practice that had just popped into my mind as well. And a few things were going back and forth in my head. The difference between working within an existing institution to bring about change and establishing something new, such as Corporation Jackson. But also, I don't know, this, maybe they're unrelated, but they came at the same time, this idea of institutionalized spaces versus the creation of something and holding a space each week, which has its massive benefits, like you're literally carving out and somebody's holding a space, which you may overlook and think, well, I don't have time for this. So there's in there. There's the rhythm, which can really serve and hold people as a refrain, and people really, in various contexts, need that thing to be held with a rhythm to it. But then there's also something valuable in spontaneity, something unexpected, something to take you out of a comforting space, something to produce these new coefficients of transversality, and they both can in their own way. But I was thinking specifically when you were talking about reflective practice of the relationship between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in a clinical sense, especially as practiced by Fanon and Uri, and the broader practices which have therapeutic coefficients or are informed as such, but also thinking about that question of aesthetics, the ways in which that kind of aesthetics that you're describing, aesthetics in a much broader sense, an ethical aesthetic paradigm, informs the clinical practice. So I remember reading a little bit about Uri, his, traditionally in psychoanalysis, people who are experiencing psychosis are deemed not to be treatable through talking methods, and yet the way in which he's describing listening to people does seem to speak a little bit to this kind of I don't know, an expanded notion of expression and communication, a suspension of, like you say, like what's necessary is a kind of to step back and to take stock of what's going on, and then to go in at different angles where moments appear. So there's something in that clinical practice of a regularity, but also this spontaneity as well. So.
No, absolutely. Funny enough, Fanon talks about, Fanon has a chapter in Wretched of the Earth called Spontaneity, Its Strengths and Weaknesses, where he's thinking about spontaneous political action. And I see a lot of, again, I can kind of see how this gets mapped on to spontaneity within a clinical sense. So in that chapter, Fanon talks about, the kind of spontaneous riot, the riot that breaks out against the killing. I'm trying to remember that chapter, but I think he contextualizes it. The French police murdered somebody, and this led to this kind of spontaneous protest, the property destruction, so on and so forth. And he's thinking about these kind of spontaneous eruptions of political resistance and what the strengths and weaknesses are. And he talks about how they're important and they're necessary, but then you need to take a step back to reflect upon it, or else it becomes a mob. And I think this is something that you also get in the clinical sense as well, where it's having this openness for a spontaneous interaction, but you also have to have a kind of structure, This was a lot of times, like if you read some of the critique that Guattari, for example, wrote about anti-psychiatry, or some of the anecdotal stories talking to like Anne or Francois about Lang and Cooper, their critique was the complete lack of structure allowed for things to become re-Oedipalized and to fall back onto, this kind of Oedipal dependency. that didn't help, ultimately. So it's about trying to negotiate the spontaneous with the structure and with the holding space. It's trying to have the refrain that keeps a structure there, but then allowing for integration of the chaos within that refrain. I know, Eric, you might probably be able to say more about this than I can. I think you're on mute.
No, I'm still struggling with the religious question, and I was just thinking. My response to that was absolutely agree with what Anthony is saying. Yes, and Fanon did engage with. He was curious about some of the traditional healing practices, and he visited them, and I also think in his project. At the end of the Wretched of the Earth, he was wanting to create a new man, a new species. So that's also very Nietzschean. Mm-hmm. And I think the relationship to Nietzsche is very interesting. I think it's also something that's really underplayed. But no, I'm just deviating. That's just kind of where my thinking is. What did you have more thoughts, Rachel? I'm just kind of putting it back onto the classic thing when one doesn't really have an answer, so you just kind of throw it straight back.
Speaking to clinical practice there, what do you think? No, yeah, I think about this in terms of political practice. What is, but it's a practical question. What's better, to work within an institution, an organization, which has complexities? And the interesting thing about being a doctor, being at the top of an organization, but especially in kind of Uri's case, having the money to fund an organization and the work, like the practical means to be able to just start from scratch is unique in and of itself. So it leaves a question for us: where do you go? Because it can really, thinking about this question about age and youth and how much energy you have, do you work within an institution to shift it, or do you start from scratch? Because often another question that comes up in this relationship between the practical or other kinds of activities and the clinical is that how do you sustain an organization, because it itself comes with its own. This is the like fundamental point of institutional analysis, right? The institution is sick, and it's not like if you make a new institution, unless you're working really carefully, and probably cooperation to action is a fantastic example of this, it becomes sick in and of itself. Like you see this time and again, like activist burnout is just like the beginning of it. It's not true in every case, but it's a question that I've been thinking about a lot, is, how do you sustain these projects, even if you are able to build them on your own terms?
I mean, two quick responses were something about we've got to form different kinds of assemblages, relationships. I mean, I think that's so vital in terms of the different relationships, one way or another, within the institution, outside the institution. Try to imagine different kinds of relationships. Continually do that. And I suppose in the process of forming relationships, I think one of the huge challenges is the fascist within all of us, and the fascist within Eric, within the group. How do we negotiate that in terms of the way that it becomes, the thinking shuts down? And that's such a difficult issue. I don't know the answer to it.
I think project-based therapy. Yeah, actually. There's a question in the chat, and then Yara has her hand up. But the question in the chat from Michael. If Michael wants to read that, or should I? Okay, maybe I'll read it. So it's, do you see the overabundance of crisis that we seem to face today as in some way crucial to contemporary colonial capitalist formations, part of its current survival strategy, or merely an outcome? What insights might therapeutic cases give us into this? And actually, I think, Joey, this relates to your idea of project-based therapy. Short answer is yes. Neoliberalism functions through crisis, but it functions through holding on to this pattern. So forgive the Lacanian thoughts here, but there's this idea that you get post Bretton Woods, post 73, with the radical deregulation of the economy, where if you look at the economic cycles from 73 to today, you see the boom and bust cycle accelerating. So we have much bigger booms and then much bigger busts, and these bust moments are closer and closer and closer together. So we come to a point that, oh, Eric, it was really good having you here.
Thanks, Eric. Bye.
So for people who didn't know, Eric had to get to facilitate a group, so he had to leave early. But anyways, so we had this moment where the boom and bust cycle of the economy gets more compressed. So if you look at like kind of traditional psychoanalytic thinking, they talked about society as being fundamentally neurotic. But post 73, it's not really appropriate to think of society as neurotic. It's properly psychotic insofar as the economic rhythm that structures so much of our social relations is based on what's often referred to as creative destruction within the kind of liberalism or libertarian neoliberal vocabulary, that just create, destroy, make cash from chaos, make cash from chaos. So the way in which we psychically deal with this, if you think about Lacanian psychoanalysis, the unconscious is structured through these overlapping functions, the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, right? But in psychosis, what happens is the knot that is your unconscious becomes unraveled. But yet, the majority of the people this happens with do not fall into psychosis because they form this thing that ties the unconscious together called the synthome. And a synthome is something that kind of wraps around your psyche and gives you structure. To keep you going on. It gives you resilience. So Lacan talked about this in terms of phobia, that phobia are really good things to have because phobia helps structure your life. So if you're agoraphobic, you're not going to move to the top of a high rise, for example, acrophobic, you're not going to go to the top of the high rise. If you're agoraphobic, you're not going to go outside. But the phobias that you have structure your life and they give you this rhythm. So for Lacan, phobia as a synthome is really, really important. What I think we have post Bretton Woods is we've all kind of developed this notion of resilience where it's this kind of obsessional, neurotic symptom that we all have. If I can just get out of bed today, if I can just get that promotion to middle management, if I can just, and it's this kind of hamster wheel, eternal return of the same that we use as resilience. So the crisis never resolves for us because we're kind of stuck in this eternal cycle. This is why I think for clinical sense, if you read Deleuze and Guattari, they have this kind of famous phrase in Thousand Plateaus where they say, a schizophrenic out for a stroll is a much better model of health than the neurotic on the couch. And they're not talking about schizophrenia as metaphor, as a lot of people say they are. They mean this quite literally. And they're not talking about the way in which schizophrenia can be quite distressing, but they're talking about the way in which psychosis, kind of going into this moment of psychosis, causes the way in which it's world creating, the way in which, in a clinical sense, you start creating a world to inhabit. And then the therapist's job is to be with you as you go through this process of creating a world and supporting you as you go through a process of creating a world to inhabit as your world kind of unravels. Francois Tosquelles wrote about this in a book translated to English as How How to Live at the End of the World with Madness. And Jean Uri wrote a brilliant book that the title translates as Creation and Schizophrenia, where they think about this process of world building and creativeness, and the kind of creative practices that go into this world building. Because they're no longer going to be resilient to these forces that say you have to get a job, you have to get a promotion. And they're saying that there's something about this creativity to say, no, I'm going to create something different, that is a political lesson to be learned. That was a really long and kind of explanation and a kind of quick compression of Lacanian theory, but I hope that made sense.